His name is Marc Marot, former MD of Island Records, talking about his new love and what he's doing and made a hugely successful business out of it. It's something called augmented reality. So without further ado, a round of applause for Marc Marot.
It's a shame that there aren't younger people in the audience. Not that you're all you're very welcome. Because this is not really a talk about augmented reality per se. It's actually about entrepreneurialism, and it's about how pushing the boundaries forward again, which has been a theme within my career, and effectively this is kind of saying to youngsters that there are new forms of art and expression that are coming that they can seize. You know, I'm wondering how many people in the audience have been exposed to augmented reality. Have any of you seen it? We've got one. And has anybody got any app on their phone already that has got augmented reality?
Doesn't Snapchat count?
No.
Are you talking about the metaverse? Sorry, when you talk about
No. I'm talking about augmented reality. We'll get onto it. It's different, and my work can be applied to the metaverse, okay. but this is physical, real world art, and I'm going to talk about how it happened really. What happened was that when I was running, I was the chairman of Crown Talent. We had about 100 clients. We managed Formula One drivers, Premier Division football players, pop stars, and we had 3 particular female artists. And we had this incredible purple patch about 6 years ago where we had 3 #1 singles in a row in the UK. So our artist Jessie J was at #1, and she was knocked off the #1 position by our artist Ella Henderson, and she was knocked off the #1 position by our artist Becky Hill. And it was an amazing purple patch. But when that happens, as you can imagine, brands come running because they think you as a company have got some sort of magic formula. It wasn't, it was just fantastic 3 coincidences really. And amongst the brands, you can imagine it's makeup, it's fashion, it's all sorts of things that can be applied to beautiful young women that are at the top of their career. But in amongst it was this very bizarre technology which was nascent, nobody ever heard of it. This is pre-Pokemon Go, which was the beginning really of augmented reality hitting the public zeitgeist. And they wanted me to try and persuade one of the labels and one of the artists to use the technology to make an album sleeve come alive. And I'll show you what that means in a minute. And I looked at it, and it's one of those things about sort of age meets opportunity meets and experience all come together. And it's going to sound prosaic, but the reality is that they showed me Heinz tomato ketchup, and they held their phone up to it, and it just came alive in the guy's hand, and a recipe book came up, and as he moved the bottle around, the recipe book stuck to it in a really unbelievably realistic way, and you thought the recipe book was in the room, but it wasn't. It was being served by the augmented reality. And I had been, by coincidence, for 2 years pestered by a wonderful painter called Scarlett Raven, who kept saying, if you can manage a Formula One driver, you can manage a painter. And my response to her was that I couldn't, because I knew nobody in the infrastructure of art. You know, even though I'd studied art, I was not in the room with the key people in the art world. And I said that I would try and keep an eye out for an opportunity, but I wouldn't take her on unless I came up with the big idea, effectively. And then I saw a Heinz tomato ketchup bottle in action, and I thought, oh my God, it's a big idea. we can do something interesting with this. And I had about 45 members of staff, and I had content creators amongst those members of staff, but none of them were capable of doing what my vision for her was. So I started working with her to show her what I thought she could do. So I started creating the animations with her, just simply to see if I could unlock within her some magic. But the problem was that it all kicked off too quickly, which sounds really bizarre. We created 2 works together. I employed the incredible actor Sean Bean, who's a Premier Division actor in the UK. You know, he's Game of Thrones, he was an amazing actor. And I employed Christopher Eccleston, who was another Premier Division actor in the UK, to perform 2 of World War I's most important poems. So one was Dulce et Decorum Est by Wilfred Owen, and the other was a Secret Sassoon poem. Because what I'd seen in Scarlett's work was that she was a poppy painter, actually. And I made the connection between the fact that there was the 100th anniversary of the end of the First World War coming up in 2 years' time, and we had 2 years with which to actually tell stories about World War I. And my inspiration for that, you're going to see later, was my grandfather by marriage, Eddie Bigwood. And this is important to me because Eddie, there's nobody in this room under 18. And at 17 years old, Eddie the whistle blew and he went over the top on the Battle of the Somme. And on that day, a shell landed near him, blew half his face away and took his teeth and took his ear. And I get very moved. He was 17 years old, you know. And they sent him back to the UK and they stitched him up and they sent him back. And he was profoundly deaf by this stage. He was 94% deaf. And at the Second Battle of Ypres, the whistle blew and somebody had to nudge him because he couldn't hear the whistle blow and he had to go over the top and do the whole thing again. And so in one of these paintings you'll see is Eddie. I realised that his stories were so powerful. He used to cry. It makes me emotional talking about it. He used to cry in telling the stories. And the one I'm going to show you later is called Shall I Sing to You? Because the way, once he got emotional when he told his stories, he would try and diffuse it by going, now, shall I sing to you? And so you'll hear him singing.
Wow.
Trevor, I didn't approach you because you were too busy. And I approached a young composer that I'd given him his first break, called Mark Cannon. And Mark Cannon scored all 67 paintings that we ended up doing for the exhibition over time. So it's so amazing, Sibakazi, that actually poetry and music, everything that you were talking about, is incorporated in everything that I do. So I was taking the best and most powerful, the poetry of the First World War changed poetry forever. It was so raw, so emotional, and so devoid of artifice that it changed poetry forever. It was so raw. And I wanted to try and incorporate that into it. And in a way, Trevor, you'll recognise this, is that we're all used to watching that Netflix show, and then on comes Trevor's music, and oh my God, it's the sad moment, she's going to die and there's nothing he's going to be able to do about it, and he loves her to bits, and we cry. And so what I wanted to do was to try and bring those moments into 3 minutes. I gave myself a 3-minute budget, effectively. And I felt qualified to do it because all those years of running Island Records, I was not just the managing director, but I was the chief creative. And that meant that we released 50 singles a year, is pretty much the average that we worked on. And for each of those, there was a video. And for each of those videos, there was between 6 and 10 scripts. And I read 50 times 10 years times 10 scripts. And so I learned what works in 3 minutes and what doesn't work in 3 minutes. And so I felt that I had qualified myself to be able to understand how to tell a story in a very short period of time. But what I wasn't was an animator. So anyway, I started doing these things with Scarlett to show her. And I was offered an introduction to a guy. I had no clue who he was. His name was Glyn Washington. And so I met at Ronnie Wood's studio, where Glyn liked to hang out because Ronnie Wood was one of his painters, one of his artists. And I met with Glyn, and I showed him the work, and I made him cry. And he was, I didn't know, one of the most senior people in the world of art in the UK. I had no clue. I was too arrogant to check up who I was meeting. It was really silly of me. And he offered Scarlett an exhibition on Bond Street, you know, a really prestigious gallery on Bond Street, immediately. and he wanted us to execute it in time for November, the 11th, which is obviously the anniversary of the war, end of the war. So Scarlett and I embarked upon creating the work. We showed 2 of them at a private exhibition in Birmingham, and they were, what you're going to see is pathetic paper prints, guys. But when I show you Scarlett's work, I'm embarrassed to say that they're paper prints, because the paintings are actually 4 foot by 4 foot. They're huge, and they are 1 inch thick with paint. She'll put £2,000 worth of oil paint on every single painting. It cost us a fortune to do this stuff just in paint. And they're incredibly impressive, and they're physical. It's in pesto. It's the Van Gogh style. They're physical. She applies paint with her hands. She applies it just with the tube. She'll use a particular scion. £15. Those are just the stalks on the flowers. £15. So they're really impressive. So anyway, we took these 2 paintings, and they're the ones that featured Christopher Eccleston and Sean Bean along to this show. And Scarlett and I, of course, we're artists. I'm an artist now, so I'm 15 minutes late. I'm a fucking artist, guys. I can be late for the first time in my career. I'm not the man. And by the time we arrived, Glyn Washington came running over and he said, "We've solved them both." And the exhibition has been open for 15 minutes. And they were still hanging there 2 days later. It was a 2-day exhibition. And I had taken iPads and headphones, which is one of the things that you get when you come to my exhibition. So you're not going to see these in the proper way either, because normally you'd have a very intimate experience with them, because you might come in a group, but then you're given headphones and you're separated, and then you're given this intimate experience. But anyway, by the end of the weekend, Glyn came over and said, "Have you had a good weekend?" to Scarlett and I. And Scarlett punched the air, and he thought she was going to say we sold 2 paintings, and he punched the air and he said, "We made 27 people cry." And then we kind of knew we were onto something, but we didn't want to hang them, because we didn't want to hang them in a conventional way. We didn't want to put them on a white wall. We wanted to do it in a slightly different way. So I went to my friends and I raised £150,000 to create a film set. So I had an amazing designer, a proper film set designer called Cave Quinn, a woman who'd done all of Danny Boyle's films. She'd done Train Spotting. She's an amazing set designer. And I gave her a brief. I said, "Cave, I need you to design me a destroyed, burnt down, bombed out art gallery in Piccadilly on the 30th of June 1916 at 10 minutes to midnight." She said, "Yeah, fine." And that's why she designed me. And you had to climb through a smashed up window over rubble to get into the exhibition. And then the only light in the room was on the paintings. And you've got the headphones, you're separated from your friends, you've got the iPad, and then you've got fucking furious Sean Bean, who knows what the words mean when he performs this poetry. And you've got a great score from a young composer, Mark Cannon, who has created bespoke music that is supporting the words. Everything that you were saying this morning with Tipakazi, it's supporting the words. The words were the king, not the animation, because I'm an amateur animator, So what happened was that this was beg, borrow and steal, the whole thing, because this is a new technology nobody's ever seen. The week that we launched was the week that Pokemon Go came out, which is the 1st of July 2016. So nobody's seen the technology. It's dark art. It's a totally unknown artist, Scarlett Raven, and I've borrowed retail space and I put a pop-up gallery inside it with this destroyed building in it. But Castle Fine Art, who we've by this stage done a distribution deal with, who own 42 galleries in the UK, are populating it with really great, committed salespeople. And what started out, this was purely an intellectual exercise. What can we do with the Heinz tomato ketchup bottle to turn it into something a little bit more valuable than that? We were open for 1 month, so we opened on the anniversary of the beginning of the Battle of the Somme, and we closed a month later. We had 10 paintings to sell. We'd sold 2 of them. We had eight paintings to sell. Castle Fine Art produced 1,000 paper prints, so they're framed and this big, and they were selling at £250 each. And and I'm going to talk about the economics of it because it is actually quite important. They also produced 100 what are called boxed canvases, so they're 3 foot by 3 foot, and they're hand embellished. So they're a reproduction of the painting, but then they're given a layer on top by other artists that work under our direction. They have to be absolutely identical to the painting, but they give a physical impression of the painting because they're putting a layer of paint on top of the paint. So they look like you'd think they were a real painting. If you touch them, they have texture like a real painting. Anyway, point being was that we had this difficult subject matter, unknown artist, nascent technology, and a borrowed space not known for art exhibitions. And the first 2 paintings had already sold. I think they were £7,500 each they'd sold for. And by the end of that 1 month, the last painting had sold for £37,500. And then 100% of the prints had been sold too. And we grossed £1.1 million in 1 month on a difficult subject matter, a nascent technology, and an unknown artist. And it was just the most extraordinary experience. But we had a problem. And that was that the exhibition, I was a manager, so the exhibition was credited to Scarlett, but she is a fascinating and really complicated person. She has really terrible mental health issues, and she would be very happy for me to talk about it. And knowing about World War I was not a priority for her. Knowing even whether Sean Bean had written the poem or was the general in the war that had prosecuted the battle, she knew nothing about her subject matter because the subject matter was mine. Hers was the beautiful paintings and the beautiful paint. And so we realised, because the press got very interested, that she was about to look like a sock puppet. If a person asked her the wrong questions, she would look foolish. So everybody around said, you're going to need to declare yourself. And I'm like, I'm the manager. But they kind of forced my hand that I needed to declare myself. And then an amazing thing started happening. It was like a chain reaction. So somebody from some cultural, I don't know, we were in a newspaper. Somebody from Liverpool's culture department, the government department, came to the exhibition unbidden. I didn't know they were coming. And they offered us an exhibition at the Martin Luther King Museum in Liverpool at the end of that year. So we closed down Greenwich, we moved to Liverpool, and we'd sold all the paintings. So I borrowed back the ones that I thought that were most important, and we had to create new work. And creating new work is complex because we like to think that we're Gilbert and George, that famous art duo, but in fact we're Wallace and Gromit. All the work is stop motion. So Scarlett literally has a camera on the ceiling, and she's on the floor with her giant 4 foot by 4 foot canvas, and every daub of paint she has to step back and take a picture and build layers. But I didn't know what green screen was or blue screen. I heard the technique, I read it in the YouTube script, but I didn't know how to do it, you know. And I quickly learned that I could actually start putting ideas into the work, and I could start creating my own part of it. So Scarlett would contribute effectively the painting, and I would contribute the story. And that was the way that we divvied up the experience. And I declared myself. So we put the second exhibition on at the Martin Luther King Museum, again, open for a month. This time we had 14 works in it, 4 from the old exhibition and 10 new works, which were really difficult to get together in time. and we sold 100% of everything again. It was the most extraordinary thing. But I do have this was running into Christmas, and I had the most fantastic photograph, which was where they did a Santa Fun Run in Liverpool that started just outside the Martin Luther King building, and at the end of it, I've got this photograph of 50 Santas with headphones watching this exhibition. I cherish that photo. It's a mad moment. Anyway, so the mayor of Liverpool opened the exhibition, and then he invited the mayor of Manchester to come to the show. The mayor of Manchester offered me the most beautiful, prestigious Manchester Central Library, which is an incredible space, for 3 months. And then the Liverpool culture team invited the head of the Belfast Titanic Museum in Northern Ireland to come. They offered us 3 months, and this thing just grew out of all proportion, to the point where my partners in Crown Talent said, "You've got to decide who you are now. You know, are you in the music business, like the chairman of this company, or are you Van Gogh?" And I was forced to make a decision, which was a difficult decision to make, because I'd had obviously 40 years of wonderful years in the music business, but this was for the first time something that I was doing for myself. And you have to think that actually, no matter what lofty position I achieved or how much money I earned, that was all in service to other people. And that's the reality of it. I was trying to make them the better person that they want to be, to have the career that they want, try and put them in a safe place, and try and make them. And suddenly, I'm forced to think, how can I do that for myself? And I've got to tell you, it's incredibly difficult to actually turn the spotlight onto yourself. It's not easy, because I was so used to doing it for other people that actually doing it for myself was very difficult. Anyway, to cut a long story short, we ended up in the National Army Museum. These are national museums that we ended up with. This is, difficult technology, unknown artists, and difficult subject matter. And I would say that we grossed, and there's a difference between, it's just like a bad record deal, there's a difference between net and gross, but we grossed probably £6 million or something like that over the time that we ran this, with this new technology. It was just the most extraordinary thing. And Scarlett, when I met her, she was working in a fruit and veg shop in Chichester, and then she was so damaged that my first meeting that I had with her, she brought her mum along to do the talking, because she was so scared that I was going to say no, that she cried. This is the first time I met her. She cried all the way through the coffee that we were having. And then there was a wonderful moment that Trevor should have scored, which was where she was crying so much that a tear formed on the end of her nose. And I'm sitting there thinking, am I going to work with this girl? And it dropped into her tea. And Trevor would have gone. And I thought, yeah, I've got to work with this girl. And it goes back to my point yesterday, where the guy from Creation Records said, "How come you work with all the psychos?" And that's because I'm a psycho myself.